everybody. Thank you for coming to this webinar. Pragmatic Works puts on a lot of these webinars, and I always enjoy presenting. And today's webinar is on Power BI tips, tricks, and best practices. And so I kind of wanted to approach this webinar from the standpoint of we're going to walk you through building a Power BI model and then building some dashboards and reports based on that model. And as we go through those steps together, I kind of want to point out some tips and tricks that you may not be aware of that kind of help you get the most out of your Power BI solution. And then, of course, point out some best practices as we step through those things that will help make your model a little more user-friendly, perform a little better, work a little better for you. My name's Dustin Ryan. I'm a senior BI consultant here at Pragmatic Works. I'm also a trainer here. Teach the SSAS classes, the Power BI class, I'm teaching the SSRS class, so teach pretty much whatever they ask me to teach. I'm also an author, a blogger, and a speaker. There's a couple of books I've worked on down at the bottom. You can find my blog at SQLDusty.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at SQLDusty. And I'm also a speaker, do a lot of speaking at webinars like this, also at SQL Saturday events, code camps, spoke at Past Summit 2013, SQL Rally, all kinds of events. However I can give back to the community, just sharing a little bit about what I know. And I've been doing this for the past 7 years for Pragmatic, and it's BI is a really fun field, and it's very interesting, and I love it. So I'm sure many of you are probably new to Power BI. It hasn't been out that long, and you may not know a whole lot about what Power BI is, but got a little question here for you. What is Power BI? Is it A, an ETL tool, B, a data modeling tool, C, a reporting tool, or D, all of the above? Think about that for a second. And you probably have correctly guessed it. It is all of the above. Power BI is a very cool and unique platform that allows us to bring together disparate data sources, create relationships between those data sources in a Power BI model, add calculated columns, add calculated measures, do all kinds of very cool transformations to the data, handle any kind of data cleansing that may be necessary based on the data sources we're pulling from. And then once we've created this model and perfected it to our liking, we can then create dashboards and reports. And then once we've created our really cool dashboards and reports, we can deploy them out to our Power BI site and share them with our users and give our users the ability to create their own reports. And so what we're going to talk about here in this session, and it's going to be mostly demo, is we're going to look at extracting our data with Power Query. We're going to connect to a couple of data sources that I found very interesting. We're going to build our model. We're going to create relationships between the objects. We're going to add some calculations, some different types of time calculations, and then we're going to design some reports, and then hopefully we'll be able to get through this as quickly as possible so that way we can actually publish the dashboards out to the Pragmatic Works Power BI sandbox. And then I want to kind of give you a little bit of a tour of the Power BI site and show you some things that you can actually do on the Power BI site that you may not be aware of. Okay, so let's get started. All right, now if you're wanting to play along, I'm going to post all this content up onto my blog, but the tool we're going to be using to build our Power BI reports is Power BI Desktop, and Power BI Desktop is free to download. If you just go out to powerbi.com, go to the Products tab up at the top, find Power BI Desktop, and you can click on that, and that's a free download. You just go download it, and what that gives you is the Power BI authoring tool that will allow you to create the models, create the calculations, and the reports. And from Power BI Desktop, then you can deploy your reports out to the Power BI site to share with the masses or your users. Okay, now for this webinar, I kind of thought about, well, what data source should I use? And I could have used Contoso or AdventureWorks, but that's kind of played out, and everybody has seen those data sources and is very familiar with those. But I thought it'd be interesting to maybe do something a little more relevant. And if you've been reading the news, you probably have read about the drought problems in California. If you just go out and Google California drought, you can find all kinds of different news articles about the drought crisis going on in California and the lack of water there. And so I thought, well, that would be pretty interesting to do maybe some Power BI analysis on the climate situation in California, since that's something that's current and relevant in the news. And so I've gone out on the web and I've downloaded some text files that have some very cool climate data in it that include the average monthly temperature, and then also the average monthly precipitation. And I've got those in a couple of text files, which you can see here. Got the year, got the months, and then the different average temperatures. And I've also got the same kind of thing here for the precipitation, the amount of rainfall here in inches, and we'll take a look at that here in a minute. So not exactly your traditional data sources, not a relational data source at all, but with Power BI we can still use these data sources nonetheless, and that's what we're going to walk through here. Okay. So I've got my Power BI desktop here. The first time you open up Power BI desktop, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see this little welcome screen. You got some links over here to forums and tutorials. These are really great resources, and I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end here. But the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to click the Get Data button. So I'm going to click Get Data here in Power BI Desktop. And it's going to open up a little wizard here, and we can see all the different types of data sources that we can connect to. Got quite a wide range of options here. Everything from Excel to text files to SQL Server, SSAS, Oracle, even some non-traditional stuff like web, SharePoint list, Facebook, Google Analytics, lots of different stuff in here, Azure, HD Insight, Spark. So lots of very cool data source options we have available to us here. In this case, we know our data is in some text files, and so we're going to import those text files into our model here. So I'm going to select text, I'm going to click Connect, and you see here my window open here to the text files I want. Let's start with the precipitation. I've got the California precipitation data here in this text file, and so I'm going to click Open here. Okay, just give this a second here while it's loading the data. Okay, cool. So you can see here that we've got a little preview of what the data is going to look like, and we've obviously got some work to do here because we can see that the years are in the first column here. Well, we've actually got an empty column here to begin with. We've got the years here in the second column, and then we've got our months over here in one total column here, so we probably want to split that out so we can work with this a little better. Now I could click the load button here, and this will load this up into our model, and we can begin actually building reports on it immediately, but it's not actually in a useful format yet. We want to be able to split the months out into individual columns. We might want to apply some formatting, some transformations here to the data, because I believe the precipitation here is actually in tenths of an inch, and so we want to convert this to inches. So instead of clicking load, I'm going to click the edit button. And what this is going to do for us is going to open our Power Query editor window. And so if you're familiar with Power Query from your days working in Excel, this is going to look very familiar to you. You can see over here on the left we have the queries that are included in this model. Now in this case we just have the one. Over here on the right we can see any transformation steps that have been applied to this data in our query. You can notice that it automatically applied a couple of transformations for us. We can see that it promoted the headers, so it correctly detected that the first row in our data was a header row, and so it moved that up to the header, and then it also did a data type change here. But I actually want to back these out because we need to do some other things first before we can promote the headers. I want to cancel these changes, so I'm just going to click the little X next to the transformations here to back these transformations out and kind of go back to where we were. Okay, so the first thing I want to do here is I actually want to split this column here into multiple columns. Now if you're familiar with SSIS, you know that probably going to take a little bit of extra work to make that happen, but here in Power Query it's very easy. So I'm just going to select this column here, I'm going to right click on it, and there's an option here, split column, that I can select and automatically split the column here into multiple columns. And of course I want to do this by delimiter. It looks like we've got spaces between the columns here, so I'm going to do by delimiter. And I can select my delimiter here. I can specify a custom delimiter if I had something in there like that wasn't an option here. But I know that I want to split this by the spaces, and I want to do this at each occurrence of the delimiter. And for my advanced options here, you can see here that it's selected 13 columns here, and that's based on the number of spaces that it's detected here. And so I'm going to leave that as is, and I'm going to click OK. Okay, and you can see here that it automatically split those out into multiple columns for us. So we've got one column for each month and one column for the year. So that looks great. So I'm going to delete these empty columns here. I'm just going to right click on them, select remove those empty columns, and I've got one here at the end that I also want to remove, so I'm going to right-click and remove there as well. Okay, so now our data is starting to look a little bit better. Now we can go ahead and promote the headers. And I'm going to go up to the top home ribbon. You can see there's an option here that I can select to say use first row as headers. So I'm just going to click that. Okay, it's starting to look a little better now. I'm going to apply a data transformation here. You can tell that this year here is aligned to the left because it's thinking that this is a text file. I want to transform this into a whole number, so I'm going to go to my Transform tab at the top, select Data Type here, and I'm going to transform this to a whole number. Okay, and that's looking good there. All right, now one thing I want to do here is I want to pivot this data so that my months are on the rows, and I've got one column for my months, and I've got one column here for my my inches of rainfall. But before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and rename these columns very quickly to month numbers because I want to be able to use these a little differently when in the model here. So I'm just going to rename these very quickly. So that they're month numbers instead of the month names, and so we can use these in some different types of date calculations. And in a few minutes, as we get into building the model out a little more, you'll see why that it's good for us to have these as the month numbers as opposed to having the month names. All right, almost there. Just bear with me, guys. All right. Okay, so I've renamed these to the column headers to the month numbers, and now I'm ready to pivot these. So I'm just going to Shift Select, like so, and select all of my columns that I want to pivot. And now all I need to do is I'm going to go back to my home ribbon here. And where is it at? I always forget where the pivot control. Oh, it's on the transform ribbon. And I want to, it's actually an unpivot. So I'm going to click unpivot because I want to move my months into an individual column. All right, looking good so far. Now I've got the months here on this column, and I've got the values here, the inches of rainfall here. So I'm going to rename this column. We're going to call this month, and I'm going to rename this column here. We'll call this just precip for short, for precipitation. And one other thing here, because I know this is in tenths of an inch, I'm going to apply some math here. Oh, we need to actually change this data type here. Let's change the data types here. This is going to be a whole number. And the precipitation here, we want to change this to a decimal. So I'm going to select the data type decimal number. And I want to apply a little math here. So I'm going to divide this column because we know this is in tenths of an inch. I want to divide it by 10. Actually, it's not in tenths, but it's hundredths. The temperature is in tenths, so I'm going to divide this by 100. Just looking at the data there, you can tell that it's in hundredths of an inch. Okay, so now we've converted this here to actually inches. So I think this is looking good. This appears to be transformed good for our purposes. And so once you've finished applying your transformations here, you can go to the File tab and you can click Close and Apply. Okay, and so what it's doing, it's applying the query changes. It's creating connection to the model. It's going to load the data up into our model based on the transformations that we've applied. And we're done. Okay, so I know that you'll notice here there's a blank screen here. You may be wondering, well, what did we actually do? Now there's three views that you can see here in Power BI Desktop. You've got the relationships view that you can see down here at the bottom. I can click this and go to my relationships view. There's the table that exists in our model. Not a lot going on here at this point because we only have the one table. We have the the data view here, which you can actually get a little preview here of all the data that we've brought into our model. So you can see here's our data that we applied all the transformations to. Over on the right, you can see the tables that are in the model. I can drill into those and see the individual fields here, year, month, precipitation, looking good here. And then this is the report modeling view where you're going to actually create your visualizations, your line charts, your column charts, bar charts, slicers, pie graphs, whatever you're going to do here. This is where we're going to do all of that. Now, rather than stepping through how to do this for the temperature, I'm actually going to switch over to a different model where I've actually kind of applied all the transformations to the temperature text file, so you guys don't have to sit through me doing that twice. One thing I want to show here, though, is in order for us to use this in the model, I'm going to create a new calculated column here based on the year and the month and the day here. So that way we can use this in our model and create a relationship to a date table, which we'll create here in a few seconds. So in order to create this new column, I can go up to my modeling ribbon up here at the top and click New Column. And this is where we'll get into our first little taste of DAX here. DAX is the expression language that we use to create calculated columns and calculated measures here in our model. In this case, I want to create a new column called Date Key. And then it's a lot like Excel. I need to use an equal sign here to specify this DAX formula. So it's going to look kind of Excel-like if you're familiar with that. And I'm going to use the date function here, which allows me to use a series of columns to specify a date value. So I'm going to use my year value, which comes from my year column. You can see we've got a hanging space there. We can fix that in a little bit. Then the second argument is going to be the month. And then the last argument is, because we don't have this at the day level, I'm just going to use the first day of the month. So I'm going to hard code in that 01 there and close parenthesis. And so when I finished writing my DAX formula, I can just hit enter. And you can see here that we've created this value here. Okay. Now we got a little issue here with the months, with these years that have gone into the 1800s, but we can exclude those in a few minutes. I'm going to right click on the year to rename this, to get rid of that trailing space, and that looks good. So if we scroll through here, we can see now that we've got this nice, neat, formatted date key value that we can use in some relationships that we're going to create here. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here to my Power BI model over here, and you can see, just to kind of show you what I'm doing here, I've got the average temperature the monthly average temperature for California here, with the same transformations applied that we did for the precipitation. There's the precipitation here. You can see that we've got the date key over here like we created. Now, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to do some analysis comparing the average temperature versus the average precipitation. And for us to do that, what I want to do is I want to bring in a date table so we can kind of relate those two to each other using a date table. Now, there's a new feature out in Power BI that was released in the past week. It's the ability to create a calculated table. So we always had the ability to create a calculated column, calculated measure, but now we can also create a calculated table. And you can see that we've got that option up here in the modeling ribbon up at the top. So if I want to create a calculated table, all I need to do is click this new table button here in Power BI Desktop. And you can see here that it's automatically created this empty table. Now we just need to start creating an expression. Now I want to call my table date table. I'm going to use the equal sign here. And now I can write some kind of expression here that will return a table. Now there's a couple of functions that will help you do that with Power BI to create a table specifically for dates. The function I'm going to use is the calendar function. And what the calendar function does is it returns a table with every single day in a time frame that you specify. So for the starting period, I know that I want to begin at 1/1/1900, and then for the end date, I'm going to go to 2015. Well, let's do for the current month. So I'm going to go all the way to 09/30/2015. Okay, and close parenthesis. And so what this function is going to do is it's going to return a table with one row for every single day between the begin date and the end date. Now I'm going to click enter. And you can see here that we've got one column, and it looks like it does have one row for every single day in this time frame. Okay, so pretty cool. Now I want to create a couple additional columns here that are going to allow us to aggregate our average temperatures and our average precipitation at year and the month level. So I'm going to click the new column button here, and I'm going to call this column year, and I'm going to use my year function. And now all I have to do is specify for the year function is the date that I want to use to return the year from. So I'm just going to write date in the square brackets, close the parentheses, and now I'm returning the year. I'm also going to do the same thing for month. Just like I did with the year. oops, not month, date. There we go. And click enter. And so now I'm returning the month number. I'd also like to be able to return the month month name. So I'll create a calculated column here called month name, and I'm going to use the format function here on the date to return the month name, and you can do that by specifying the triple M there, capital M, to specify you want to format the date as the month name. Okay, you can see I've got the little abbreviated month name there, so that's nice. Okay, so this is looking good. I've got kind of a date dimension. If you've come from an analysis services or a data warehousing background, you're probably familiar with the date dimension. So that's basically what we're doing here, is kind of creating a date dimension that we can use to relate these two tables together. All right, now I still need to create the relationships here between our date table and our temperature and our precipitation table, and so all I need to do that is I'm going to click on my date column here and just drag it and point it right at the date key. Oops, I need to do it the other way. I need to drag the date key and point it at the date in the date table. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. All right, looking good. Okay, so now we've got a relationship here, so that now our date dimension here is tied to the average temperature and the precipitation. All right, now a couple other things here I'm going to point out to you. When we go over to the report authoring view, you'll see over here on the right that we have our tables that are included here in the model. All right, let's see. Where is our, there's our visualizations. All right. Actually, I've got these hidden right here, so I want to unhide these columns here. So when I was working through this before, let's do this. Let me unhide these. And the reason I had hidden these, and this is something you'll want to consider as a best practices. Sometimes in your Power BI model, you may have columns that are useful for calculation purposes or not important for the users to see. And in those cases, you want to hide those columns. And so by hiding a column, what that does is it just hides it from the user from being able to see it in the model. It doesn't mean we can't use it in other things. We can still use it in calculations, but in certain situations, we may not want to display the value in a column or the column to a user. And in those situations, you can just right-click on the column and select Hide in Report View. And what this does is it keeps it in the model, but it just hides it from the user. And I can tell that it's hidden because if you look at this particular column here that I just hid, you'll notice that it's kind of grayed out, indicating that this is hidden in the model. I can also see it over here in the fields list that it's also slightly grayed out here too. Now these columns here in the precipitation table are already grayed out because I've hidden those from the users, and you'll see why here in a few minutes. Now if I go back to the report authoring view here, we can see the tables that are included in the model. There's our average temperature, there's our date table. Now if I want to begin building reports, all I have to do is check the columns that I want. So imagine if I want to look at year, you can see here that I've got it just automatically created this bar chart or this column chart here with the year. It dropped the year into the values here. And the reason that it did that is because that it has detected that the year value is a numeric column. And so it's kind of making the assumption here that Power BI is assuming that, okay, because this is a year or because it's a number, you must want to aggregate this. And so that's why it automatically dropped it here into the value, and it appears to be aggregating the years. Now that obviously that doesn't necessarily make sense for our users. I can turn off this behavior if we go back to the data view over here. I'm going to go to my date table over in the fields list. I'm going to select the year column, and there's a property here, default summarization. This is also a new feature in the past couple of weeks that the Power BI team at Microsoft has implemented. I'm going to click the drop-down list there, and I'm going to tell it that I don't want this to summarize. The year should not be summarized. I'm going to do the same thing here for the month number. I'm going to turn off the summarization of this, the aggregation of this column, because it's not going to make sense for our users to aggregate the month numbers or the year numbers. So you can turn that off there. Now if we go back to our report over here, you can drop this over here on the axis, and that's going to make a little bit more sense. Okay, so we've got the year on the axis, but we obviously aren't displaying any data here. That's because we're not using a value. If I want to display the temperature here as the value, I can drop that here as well. And so now we've got this column chart here. We've got the temperatures being displayed here on the as the value for the report. Now, obviously, this isn't an extremely useful report, but we're going to work on that here in a few minutes. Now, if I want to change this visualization, it's very easy to switch visualization types. You can see the many different options of visualization types you have over here on the right. I can switch to a line chart if I want to do that. I could switch to an area chart. You can do that. You also have the ability to switch to a pie chart. That's not super useful. You've also got the funnel chart over here. Not really useful just because of the sheer number of values that we're showing here. Or you can go to back to the column chart. You get the 100% stacked column chart, the stacked column chart, or the regular clustered column chart, which is a very common chart type that you'll probably use. Okay, if I want to remove this chart, I can just click the little ellipsis up here in the top right, click remove, and let's bring in our month name over here. Okay, so we've got our month name, and I can bring in the average temperature for the different months, or this is rainfall. Sorry, no, this is average temperature. So obviously, we've got some issues here with our data. We can see that the month names are being sorted in alphabetical order, so that's probably not the default behavior that we want. So I'm going to get rid of this chart type. We're going to go back to our data view over here. And for the month name, I want to set the sort by column property. So I'm just going to select this column here, and I'm going to specify that I want to sort by a different column. So I'm going to click sort by month number. Now that's going to make a lot more sense for our users. Instead of sorting by the month name, we want to make sure that we sort by the month number. So that way, back in our report view, if my users drag in the month name, now this is sorted correctly. So we can see that we're now sorting this instead of alphabetically, we're sorting this by the month number. Okay, so let's create our chart here. I'm going to remove this, and I want to create a line chart. So I'm going to click the line chart here to drop in a blank line chart. And I'm just going to kind of resize this by grabbing the handles here on the left and the right. And I want to put my years down here at the bottom. So I'm going to drop my years on the axis. Okay, and that looks good. And now I can put the temperature here on the values. Okay, and so we kind of get this trend line here, but this isn't super useful. So what I want to do is I want to go back to my data view, and I want to create some calculated measures. Okay, so I'm going to do this. Let's do this for the precipitation. Okay, so we've got our precipitation here. I want to create a new calculated measure. I'm going to click the new measure button up here at the top, and we're going to call this, let's create one for average precipitation. And I'm going to use the average function here. And I just need to select the column that I want to calculate the average for. And in this case, it's our precipitation. I'm going to close parentheses and click enter. And we've got a new calculated measure. And you can tell over here in your field list which measures are calculated columns, which are calculated measures. We can tell this is a calculated measure because it has the little calculator icon over here. We can tell this is a calculated column because it's got the little function icon here. Now we've got an average precipitation. I'd also like to create one for the maximum precipitation, so that way we can calculate the maximum precipitation for a given year. So I'm going to use my max function, specify that column that I want to calculate the maximum value of, and in this case it's the precipitation. And I'm going to click enter here, and I'm going to do one more for the minimum precipitation. There we go, close parentheses, hit enter there. All right, so now we've got three calculated measures. We've got the average precipitation, we've got the maximum precipitation, the minimum precipitation, and so now we can use these in our report. All right, let's go back to our report view. And for the precipitation, I'm going to drag in the average precipitation here and drop it down here on the values. Let's get rid of the temp out of here because I want this report here just to show the average precipitation. So we've got our average precipitation, and I'd like to be able to compare that with the maximum precipitation for each year. Okay, and we've got the minimum precipitation. Okay, now you notice here we've got some kind of outliers here in the data, and this just has to do with the fact that there's some empty values at the end of the 2015 for the months that haven't occurred yet in the text file and the data I got off the internet. They have just included those as 99.9, so we would want to do some data cleansing there to correct those issues. One way that we can do that is if we go back to our data view, go back to home, you can click Edit Queries. The Edit Queries up here at the top. And this is going to take us back to our query editor window. And I'm going to click for California precipitation here. I want to apply a filter to this column. You can just click the little arrow, kind of like you do in Excel if you want to apply a filter. And you can scroll until you find the values that you want to exclude. There it is. I want to make sure I exclude all of those because I know that's not good data, and I'm going to click OK. And that's going to apply a filter there, so that way we're excluding that kind of bad data there. Once we're finished applying the additional transformations, I'm going to click Close and Apply, and this is going to reload the data. So this will just take a moment here to reload the data. All right, now let's go back to our report view. And you can see here that we've eliminated that bad data, and so now the chart is a little bit easier to look at. Okay. Now, one thing that we can do here is we can apply some nifty color formatting here to our chart. We can see that the average here is showing up as the green line, the maximum precipitation for each year is showing up as the black line, and the min is the red line. I want to change this, so I'm just going to make sure I've got my line chart selected here. I'm going to go to the formatting option over here on the right, click the little paintbrush, and you can set the data colors here for each line in a line graph. So I'm okay with the average precipitation being green, but the max, I'd really like to show the max as red, and then the min, we're going to show it as this, this darker color here. And I think that'll make a little bit more sense to our users. Okay. Now we can select the formatting here for this chart again. I'd like to show the data labels for this. I think that'll make a little bit more sense for the users, so I can just go down here to the data labels section, turn this on, and we'll see that we can get the data labels here. So we can see the maximum, the average, and the minimum precipitation that occurred for each month in a given year. Okay. So we've got this pretty cool line chart here. This is looking good. I'd like to be able to give my users the ability to filter this. We're looking at all of our data from the year 1900 to 2015, so that's kind of a lot to digest at one point, at one time. So I can create a slicer by coming over here to the right and selecting the slicer option. And this works very similarly to how a slicer works in Excel, if you're familiar with that. So I'm going to resize it a little bit, and I want the users to be able to slice on year, so I'm just going to drop my year over here on the fields. And we can see here that we've got our year slicer, and so now all a user has to do is select a given year. Now, of course, we're showing our years on the x-axis, so if I want to see more than one point, I need to select more than 1 year. And you can see here that as I select years, you can see that this dynamically filters our line chart over here. So there was no additional work required to get that working. The connection between the two data visualizations is automatically created for us. Now you can see 1900 is up here at the top, and there's a lot of year values here. If I scroll all the way down, you can see 2015 is down here at the bottom. If I want to change how this is sorted, I can click the little ellipsis here up at the top right of the slicer visualization and tell it to sort by year. And so what that will do for us is it'll move the more current years up here at the top. So now that way our users can select which years they'd like to visualize. Okay. So that looks pretty good. But one thing that our users in this particular case like to do is they like to view time frames in buckets. So they like to do a lot of analysis on the past 5 years, maybe the past 10 years, past 20 years. And so in order to give my users the ability to bucket these years, I'm going to go back to my data view over here, and I want to create a calculated column here in our date table that will group our years up into buckets. Okay, so I'm going to create a new calculated column, and we're going to call this year group. Okay, and I've already got the formula written here, so that way you guys don't have to suffer through me trying to write all the stacks on my own. And so I'm just going to paste this in here, and I'll show you what's happening here. I'm just using a simple nested if function here, and the if in DAX works pretty much like it does in every other expression language. You can specify a condition. I need to create that relative year column here, so we'll do that. But you can specify a condition. So if the relative year is -5, if it's in the past 5 years, I want to show the value last 5 years. If the relative year is in the past 10 years, I want to show the bucket 5 to 10 years. If it's in the past 20 years, I want to show the 11 to 20 years. So we're going to create this dynamic bucketing here. So I'm going to click enter, and we've got an issue here with that because the relative year column doesn't exist yet, but I need to click create that first. So I'm going to create a new additional column here that we're going to call relative year. Come on now, sorry guys, clicked on the wrong thing. So new column, we'll call this relative year, and it's going to be my year value minus the year for now. Okay, and so what that's going to return is a number, a negative number for years that are in the past, and a positive number for years that are in the future. So that way I can dynamically look for a given year. So each time the Power BI model is updated, this function here is going to be based off the current year. So that way, if we do an update and we go to a new year, I can still build calculations based off the -1 relative year to always find what is the previous year's value. And so once I created this relative year column, you can see now that I've got these greater than 50 years buckets, or I've got these year group buckets. And so as I scroll through these, you can see here that now I can bucket my data into these groups. So if we go back over here to our report, instead of using the year for the slicer, I want to use my year group. So I'm just going to drop my year group on the slicer. And so now I've got this nifty little slicer over here that I can select multiple years just by specifying these buckets. So I've got 5 to 10 years over here. If I want to look at last 5 years, I can select that. 21 to 50 years, 11 to 20. So you can see how I can group the years up into buckets and automatically get these very cool bucketing behavior and give our users the ability to look at groups of years or chunks of time at once without having to dig through our year slicer and find the individual years that we're interested in. Okay, so that looks good. Now, what I want to do now is I want to create a kind of a dashboard here that shows my California precipitation, being able to compare it to this year and last year. And we can do that by creating time calculations in Power BI. So there's a lot of really cool time functions and time intelligence functions that you have access to in DAX. And all that's required for you to do that is to have a relationship to a date table that is using a date data type as the key. So we can see here that our date table that we created dynamically does have a date time data type. I can tell it's a date time data type by looking up here at the top for date time. And it's related to our tables that we want to perform the date calculations on. You can see here that we've got the relationships here. And so if I want to create a time calculation, I'm going to go to the table that I want to create the calculation on, and in this case I want to be able to calculate what is the average precipitation for this year. Okay, now I can use my average precipitation to be able to look up what is the average precipitation for this year, but if I want to be able to compare it to what is the average precipitation for last year, I need to create a new calculation for that. And to do that, I'm going to click the new measure button up here at the top. Okay, and for this calculation, I want to, I'm going to call this, let's call this last year precipitation, and I'm going to use the equal sign here. And whenever you create a calculated measure, typically you're going to use the calculate function, and what the calculate function does is it says just perform a calculation that will return a single value for a given time frame or a given value in a table or a given category, something like that. So the calculate function is going to be one that you're going to be very familiar with when you create calculated measures in Power BI. So I want to calculate the average precipitation for and this is where we're going to use our time intelligence function here, the same period last year. Now the same period last year is just going to return a period in time for the same period from whatever current year you happen to be looking at. So the same period from September 2015 last year is going to be September 2014, and the same period for the year 2015 last year is going to be the year 2014. So it's going to be very dynamic, and you'll see how that's going to work here. And now I just need to specify what is the date column that we want to use, and it exists in my date table here. Okay, and so I'm saying calculate the average precipitation for the same time last year. And this is going to allow me to find what is my last year, the precipitation for last year, so that way I can compare my current precipitation this year to last year's precipitation. Okay, so I've got my calculation here. I'm going to go back to my report, and I want to put this on a different report over on a different sheet. So I'm just going to click the little plus button down here at the bottom to create a new sheet. And you can have many, many different sheets that exist in a report. I forget what the number is, but it's something. It might even be thousands. I think at this point, well, maybe it's hundreds. I can't remember what the exact number is, but you can create many different sheets in a given Power BI model. So I'm going to create a new sheet here, and I want to add a gauge here to the report. So I'm going to click Gauge, the gauge visualization, and it's added an empty gauge visualization here. And I want to view my average precipitation as the value on this gauge. Okay, so we can see what the average precipitation is here. And I want to compare this to the last year's precipitation. So I'm going to drop this as the target value. Okay, and you'll see here that the target and the value are exactly the same now, and that's because we haven't specified a given time frame to look at. We're just looking at the raw numbers here. And so what I'd like to be able to do is look at last year. So I'm going to take my relative year column here, and I'm going to drop this as a visual level filter. And what that means is that this filter is only going to be applied to this single visualization. It's not going to affect anything else in the Power BI report. Okay, so I want to show items when this value is -1. So if you'll remember from our visualizations that from our when we were creating this calculated column for relative year, it's going to return a number that is going to indicate how many years ago we want to look at. And so if I specify -1 here, this means that I want to calculate the average precipitation for this year or last year or something like that. So -1 would mean last year. If I want to do the current year, I can use 0 here. So I'm going to leave this as a 0 because I want to calculate what is the average precipitation compared to last year's precipitation. And I'm going to click Enter. And we can see here that we've got our average precipitation for this year compared to last year, and we can see that right now we're kind of tracking that our average precipitation is going to be a little higher this year compared to last year. So that's pretty cool that we can do that. Now what I'd like to do is create a kind of a year-over-year percent in change calculation here. So I'm going to go back to my data view over here, click a new measure. Okay, and we're going to call this year-over-year growth, or we'll call this year-over-year change precipitation. How about that? Okay, and so if I want to calculate what is the year-over-year change percentage, I can just take my average precipitation and subtract last year's precipitation from it to figure out what is my change, what is my change in amount of average precipitation, and click Enter there. All right, we can go back over here, and I'm going to create a new visualization. I'm just going to click my year-over-year change, and you see that it's automatically created the column chart, but I want to display this as a card. Okay, and we need to give it a time frame here to be looking at, and so we're going to add our relative year filter again. This is going to be a visual level filter again, just like we did a minute ago, and I want this to be looking at the current year. Okay, you can see here that it's saying that the year-over-year change precipitation is 1, so I know that's not exactly correctly correct there, so we have to probably look at and figure out, why are we getting this one difference here in the average precipitation. But we've created our card report here, and one other thing that I'd like to be able to do to add to this visualization is I'd like to create some kind of a trend line for my users to be able to look at. So I can click the little line chart here. I'm going to add a line chart, and I'm going to add my average precipitation to it. as a value, and I'm going to specify that I want to display the years on the axis. So we've got this little line chart here, and I'm going to add a year group to this report like we did before. We're going to convert that to a slicer simply by selecting the slicer option here. And I'm going to select, let's say, last 5 years, okay? And in order to convert this to kind of a trend line, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this line chart. I'm going to go to my formatting over here, and I'm just going to turn off all the axis here. I'm going to turn off the title, turn off the background, do all of that. So that way what I'm left with is just kind of this nifty little trend line that we can then use in our report. So by using this method, we can create this pretty cool looking little dashboard here with a gauge chart, with a card visualization, and a trend line here. Now I know I've been moving kind of quickly here, but after this is over, I've got all of my steps lined out, and I'm going to publish this to my blog so that way you can kind of see all of this step by step. And the recording here is also going to be available online too. Now, I know I've moved through this very, very quickly, but I'd kind of like to show you the end product because we're running out of time here. So I'm going to move this over here. Let's go back here to, let me pull up this over here. All right, here's the kind of dashboard that I kind of created ahead of time when I have more time to kind of step through this. You can see here that we've got our year grouping slicer over here on the left. I've added the line chart up here on the top, applied some additional color formatting. We've got the clustered column chart down here at the bottom that shows the max, the average, and the minimum temperature by year. So that way we can kind of see, compare the temperatures there. So looking pretty good. I've got the precipitation dashboard on this other sheet that I've created over here. You can see I've got the maximum precipitation, comparing the maximum precipitation for the current year, average precipitation, minimum precipitation. And then I've also created these kind of cards that act as kind of a KPI where you can quickly see what is our growth, what is the percent change. Added the trend lines just like we did a minute ago. And then I've also added the column here, the year-to-date and the year-to-date last year to be able to compare what is our precipitation growth. And then I've also created this temperature dashboard. So one of the things that you can take advantage of with your Power BI dashboards is the kind of natural cross-filtering that you have between report visualizations in your report. So for instance, if you're looking at, like on this temp dashboard, I have a column chart here, and this is a column chart that simply has groups for the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years, 11 to 20 years, 21 to 50 years, and greater than 50 years. So if I want to take a look at what is the average temperature, the maximum temperature, and the minimum temperature for the past 5 years, in this chart all I have to do is select that value, and you can see that it automatically filters the rest of this report. So now I'm looking at the average, max, and min temperatures for the last 5 years. If I want to look at the 5 to 10 year range, I can select that, and you can see that it dynamically filters the report area here. 11 to 20 years, 21 to 50 years, and so I can get a really nice idea of how are my average and max and min temperatures changing for that time frame. So as I was looking at this, trying to figure out, okay, how is the temperature and the climate changing in California over the last 5 to years compared to the 50 years ago? If I look at the last 5 years, I can see that the average temperature was 60 degrees, the max was 78, and the min was 42. If I look at the years greater than 50 years ago, I can see that the average temperature is a little lower. The maximum temperature is just 1 degree higher, but the minimum temperature is much lower. So we had a minimum temperature of 32 degrees, an average minimum temperature of 32 degrees for more than 50 years ago. So we can see that the minimum temperature has definitely increased in California. So whatever the reason for that is, I don't know. I can't tell from this data here, but we can see that there is something going on with the climate here in California. You can do that, and I can see that by looking at the individual years and calculating those averages. Okay. Now once you finish building your reports and you're ready to deploy, you can just go up here to your Publish button up here and click Publish, and this will publish it to your Power BI site. I've already published this, and so that's why it's giving me this little message here saying, hey, you're about to replace this. So I'm just going to click Cancel because I don't want to replace it. But I've already got this published out here. And if you log into your Power BI site, you can see that two things have been published here, and this is the Pragmatic Works Power BI sandbox. So I can see my report here. In the left, you'll see the reports that have been published. If I click on California temp rainfall, we can see the report that I published. I can, interact with it like I was, just like I was in Power BI Desktop. But also, your data set was published here. And so now users can build their own reports based on this data set that we published. So I can come over here, I can start, doing different things, bringing in different types of data here and creating my own visualizations. And so users that may not have Power BI Desktop on their machine or may not have access to the data can still build their own reports based on your deployed data set. And so once you've built your data set, you can save it off to somewhere else, share it with whoever, do whatever you want to do with it there. So that's very cool. I'm going to go back to my report over here and click Don't Save because I don't want to save this report. But once you've built your report and deployed it, you can also create dashboards. And dashboards are basically collections of visualizations that exist in one or more reports. And so maybe I want to create a dashboard that shows this visualization. So I can click the little pen icon up in the top right and save this to an existing dashboard or a new dashboard. I can do this for any visualization in any report. So I could pin any of these visualizations just by clicking the little pin icon here. And when I've done that, what I'll end up with is this California climate dashboard that I've created. And you can see here, and I got a little issue here with this visualization that I need to correct, but we can see here that I can come to this dashboard and get all kinds of relevant information that maybe I've determined that are more valuable to me. So if I want to come in here and look at my dashboard to see what is the current average temperature, the max temperature, min temperature, if I want to look at the trends here, I can see those things as well. And then I can click on these and I can look at take me straight to the report and get a better idea of what exactly is going on in my California climate data. Now, this is very, very cool, very easy to do. I know I kind of breezed through this quickly, but one of the really nice things that you get here, and I'm going to try to risk this, what I want to do here is I want to share my webcam so that way hopefully I can show you a couple of things on my iPad and my iPhone that you may not be aware of with Power BI. So hopefully this will work okay. All right, so hopefully you guys can see me okay. And so you might want to make the webcam a little bit bigger on your screen because I'm going to show you a couple of things here on my iPad. So there's a really nifty little Power BI apps that you can download on your iPad and on your iPhone, and so that way all you have to do to be able to look at that is log into your Power BI app and you can view the reports on your Power BI app. So you can see here that I've got my Power BI app over here. Let me pull this up so I can show you guys that. You just open your Power BI app, there it is, and then once you've done that, you can just click on your visualizations, get more information, do all kinds of stuff. And from here, you can actually even share your visualizations to other users. You can create annotations by marking up on the screen. You can do all kinds of stuff like that. And then you can share the visualization. So if you have a question about a visualization, you can just mark it up on your screen, email it off to a friend, do whatever you want to do there to find out, get more information from your team on what's going on with that. So that's all built into the Power BI app, and it's very easy to use. There's no special security settings or anything you have to do to get that to work. It automatically picks up all the reports and everything from your Power BI site, so that way whoever has permissions to the report can access those. You also have the Power BI app on your iPhone. So I've got my iPhone here. See here that I can just scroll through here on my iPhone, see the Power BI visualizations on there. And one of the really cool things that you get with your iPhone is the ability to set alerts. So you can set alerts on the card visualizations type. And so you'll notice up here at the top I got this little bell button here. If I click that, you'll see here that I can select kind of thresholds here when I want to get alerted for changes in my data. So for instance, if the temperature ever goes above 80 degrees, the average temperature ever goes above 80 degrees, maybe I want to get an alert for that, get some kind of email, something like that. So you can do some very cool stuff with your Power BI reports once you've got them deployed. All you have to do is just set up the alerts, deploy your reports out there, then you can set up the alerts, you can do the annotations, you can build new reports from your deployed data sets and do all kinds of different things like that. Save a few minutes here for any questions that you guys might have. I know we kind of ran through that very quickly, but I hope you guys learned a little bit about some of the capabilities that you have with Power BI, some different tips and tricks that you can do to create some useful not KPIs, but gauges and lines and column charts, and then share them with your users in very cool and interesting ways. So thank you for coming, and I'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay, there are a lot of questions, so we're definitely not going to get to all of them, but I'll pick out some that maybe have been repeated a little bit. People want to know how the data is refreshed on PowerBI.com and if you can auto-refresh it.
Okay, so you can auto-refresh it. You can schedule refreshing through, so if your data, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. So if your data is on-prem, like in a SQL Server data source or something like that, you'll use what is called the Power BI desktop or Power BI personal gateway. And so this gets installed on whatever machine where your data exists, and this basically allows Power BI in the cloud to access your on-prem data. Once you've done that, then you can refresh your data automatically that way. You can also refresh your data if you come in here to your data over here. You can click schedule refresh and schedule that way, or you can do refresh now to automatically, or just refresh that on demand whenever you want to do that. If you're in Power BI desktop and you want to do a refresh, you can just come in here to your data view, go to home, click the refresh button, and it'll do a refresh there in desktop too.
Okay. Several people have asked about the Power BI app for Android.
There is one for Android. I don't have an Android phone, so I haven't been able to play with it. Obviously, I've got an iPhone and an iPad, so I've been able to test it out there. I know there is a Power BI app for Android, and I would assume that it works very similarly to the iPad and iPhone app, but you should be able to download that and check that out. You can come in and play with the Power BI stuff for free too. You can just log in and create, if you use your work account, you can create a free little Power BI sandbox to kind of try that out and play with that.
Okay. A couple of people have asked about DataZen. So I will say that Brad Gall recently did a two-part series on DataZen. So if you go to the past webinar section of our website and search DataZen or Brad Gall, you will be able to find those. They were pretty recently, so you shouldn't have to go back too far. And a couple of people have also asked, Dustin, is Power BI going to be available on-prem?
So deploying Power BI to an on-prem data, or like an on-prem Power BI site, I do not know the answer to it. Obviously, right now that doesn't exist. There is no on-prem Power BI, so I'm not sure if that's coming or if that's some point in the future or not.
Okay.
For those of you that are interested in DataZen, if you go out to pragmaticworks.com, if you go to training and you go to past webinars, you can see all of our past webinars. The recording for this webinar will be there as well. You can see the DataZen webinars. Brad Gall has done a couple of really nice webinars on setting up DataZen, designing your first DataZen dashboard. And so if you just go and do a search for DataZen, you can see the webinars there and get information related to that. A couple other resources I'd like to point out to you. I do a lot of blogging at SQLDusty.com, so you can find some other blogs that I've done on Power BI and other Microsoft BI related topics. So check out SQLDusty.com. The Power BI knowledge base is a really great resource. If you just go to PowerBI.com, you can go to support, go to documentation, you can get access to the knowledge base, and they've got lots of really great information. So if you're new to Power BI or you're wondering how something is done in Power BI, check out the knowledge base. If you're going to download Power BI Desktop, like I said before, just go to PowerBI.com, go to Products, Power BI Desktop, and that's free to download. You can start playing and building your own dashboards there.
Great. There are a ton of questions that I know we didn't get to, so I will make sure to get those to Dustin so he can do hopefully a blog about those as follow-up and kind of condense them a little bit. As we said, all our sessions are recorded, including this one. You'll receive a link to that area tomorrow. with the recording. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to email us. You can email Dustin at dryan@pragmaticworks.com, or you can email me, Liz. It's the email address that comes with all your GoToWebinar emails. Like I said, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to talk to everyone soon.